Yeah. So if our kind of fundamental assumption is the death of God, there is no moral truth. I think you're right. I think this is why happy endings, when they appear in something like a Hallmark movie, seem so cheap, because they're not rooted in any deeper metaphysical reality. They're kind of unearned. They don't. It comes across more as wishful thinking rather than an earnest effort to tell the truth about the reality of the world.
You recently remarked that Virginia Woolf thought Jane Austen created her characters merely for the purpose of giving herself, quote, the supreme delight of slicing their heads off.
Yes. Yeah, that's a quote that's always stuck with me. And I think that's sometimes true and sometimes not true. I think that so the idea there is that Austen does not hold back. If her characters have acted badly, they're going to kind of get their comeuppance at the end of the story. So I think we see that happen. But she also, I think, wants to give her characters, if we can talk about her characters as having their own kind of will, apart from the author, she gives them the opportunity to kind of repent of their mistakes. And I think these are actually the two big character types in Austen's novels. There are the characters, and this is really what distinguishes, I think, the heroes and the heroines in her books from, what we could simply call the villains. There are the characters who are willing to see what they've done wrong and to make amends for that and to change their behavior and to do some deep introspection and search after self-knowledge, and are willing to do the hard work of reformation. And then there are the characters who kind of either always live with a false version of their own virtue, or they kind of have a chance to see themselves in the mirror for who they really are and decide to look the other way. I think that's the big split, the big moral split in her books.
And I think it's part of what makes her books so loved, because there's that realism, and that even as we're rooting for characters, we know that, like us, they're flawed. I always think of Emma and the movie Clueless, inspired by Emma, and how much I love that story, but Emma is so deeply flawed.
Yes. And I actually think that's really interesting, because I think that her most popular books are the ones in general that feature those deeply flawed central characters. So Emma's a great example of this. She's even more kind of pig-headed, if you want to put it that way, than Elizabeth. But of course, Elizabeth Bennet is also one of the most beloved characters. So Pride and Prejudice, Emma, I think are the two big ones. And then the least popular novel is, I think, universally Mansfield Park. And maybe that's because Fanny Price doesn't really need to change a lot. She's already this kind of long-suffering heroine who's persecuted from the outside, whose virtue is kind of put to the test, and she's tempted in all kinds of ways. And she, for the most part, kind of makes it through. But she never has to have this, this deep recognition of how horrible she's behaved. So I think you're right.
Yeah. Is there a danger then in her being almost too perfect? Mansfield Park is the one Austen I think I haven't read.
Okay, yeah, you're not alone. That was the book that I picked up, struggled to get through, put it down, and it took me a few times when I was a teenager to get through it. It's grown on me, but yeah, I think Fanny Price is she's not a very modern heroine. She's not like Emma and Elizabeth, who have this spunk and vivacity and the spirit of independence about them. Fanny Price is very meek. She's very retiring. She can barely go, pick roses in the flower bed without becoming extremely fatigued. But she has this kind of moral strength that I think would have, so there is this problem of maybe Fanny Price is too perfect. And Jane Austen has this famous quote where she says, "Pictures of perfection make me sick and wicked." I think maybe, it's interesting how that has sort of translated into, the experience of readers today. On one hand, Elizabeth Bennet seems like the perfect character to us, but she is flawed. Fanny Price may have seemed more perfect in the early 19th century, but we just find her kind of piety, her meekness, a little alienating. Those don't really map onto modern female virtues.
Well, and this was such a great lead in, because I fear that too many readers and audiences today dismiss Jane Austen as being too perfect, as endings being too happy.
Yes.
And I want to talk more about that. I wonder if today, as so much of my generation is addicted to social media, and we're in this bizarre new situation where we're consuming stories at all times, at all hours, perhaps we are inclined, for many reasons, to read Jane Austen improperly. And I wonder what you think about that. How should we be reading Austen today?
Oh, that's such a... I feel like I have many answers to this, but how are we reading Austen improperly? I mean, the thing that I'm the most interested in right now is how easy it has been for modern readers to kind of completely strip away the religious context and the religious significance of how the novels are put together, how they're conceived, how even just the way the plots are designed are modeled after a kind of Christian system. And what is remarkable about Jane Austen is to quote from one of her early readers who was an archbishop and said that her religion was not at all obtrusive. I think this is partly why Jane Austen has aged well and why we still continue to read her rather than some of her own favorite novelists today, like Samuel Richardson, who was a generation or two before Austen. And he really, he doesn't quite have an altar call at the end of the novel, but he's much more overt and much more didactic. And wears his kind of Christianity more overtly on his sleeve. And I think in Austen's novels, it's much more subtle, which I think has made it easier to ignore it. And so I think there's been a lot of confusion about how to read Austen if you take away the religious context.
And you recently drew audiences to the idea of poetic justice. You gave a lecture at the University of Texas at Austin, and you discussed poetic justice, which you were referencing when we started, to this inherent justice to the plot in Austen's novels.
Exactly, yeah. So poetic justice is this idea that has been around since the ancient world, but the term really first originates in the late 17th century. In 1678, this critic, Thomas Reimer, coined the phrase poetic justice. And this is a really simple idea. It's something that we're all familiar with from fairy tales, from children's books. But it's the idea that at the end of a story, the virtuous should be rewarded and the wicked should be punished. One of my favorite quotes about this comes from Oscar Wilde, the 19th century English playwright and wit. And he has a character in The Importance of Being Earnest, his play from 1895, say something like, "The virtuous ended happily and the wicked were punished. That is what fiction means." And this was just a widespread kind of doctrine or an idea, and it was something that was very much discussed throughout the 18th century, really kind of in the literary world and context that Jane Austen was born. So many of the authors she read would have been writing fiction that played with or fulfilled the kind of dictates of poetic justice, and would have been talking about it explicitly. But this word, this phrase, poetic justice, has almost entirely disappeared from the critical vocabulary of scholars reading Austen today. So, for example, this book just came out about a year ago. It was called Jane Austen and the Price of Happiness, I think, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. So pretty, well-respected press, and it kind of purports to be the first full-length study of the endings of Austen's novels. And she pairs all of the books with different kind of pop culture adaptations, mostly film, but some kind of sequels and spin-offs. And she does not once mention the concept of poetic justice. And for me, it's a big oversight. It's really hard to talk about Jane Austen's novels separated from this concept.
How does she interpret the endings then, if she's not acknowledging justice in their conclusions?
Yeah, that's a good question. She's really, her main audience in this book are kind of popular or non-scholarly readers of Austen, who are primarily coming to the stories for the kind of fairy tale romance ending, who just kind of want to sit down with a bowl of popcorn and the Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice, which I think is celebrating an anniversary this year. And just sit down and you're just living for that moment when Mr. Darcy walks across the misty field and comes to propose once again to Elizabeth. And of course, the misty field does not appear in the novel. So part of her point, and I think this is exactly right, part of the author's point is that Austen's endings are fairly curtailed. And if you are coming to Austen's novels for the first time, having seen a lot of film adaptations, then you're probably going to be surprised by how quickly the ends come together and how much Austen does not dwell on the details of the proposal, the kind of denouement, the wedding, the kind of, butterfly feelings when the characters do find their happily ever after. I think the most maybe jarring example of this comes at the end of Mansfield Park. Mansfield Park, again, the hardest novel to love, also partly because it's the least satisfying romantic plot. Fanny Price, the heroine, is kind of taken in by her aunt and uncle and raised like one of her cousins, like they're all siblings. And she forms this kind of very strong attachment to her older cousin, Edmund Bertram. And when she's a teenager, falls in love with him. Edmund, for most of the book, has been kind of swept away by Mary Crawford, who's she's kind of like Elizabeth Bennet's evil twin. She has no kind of strong moral sense, but she's very witty and vivacious. Anyway, so Edmund is in love with Mary Crawford the whole time. Fanny is kind of patiently waiting for him, hoping that maybe he won't marry Mary, and he doesn't. And he and Fanny do marry at the end of the book, but it's almost entirely off the page. Austen says something like, Edmund's love for Mary Crawford lasted as long as it should have. It took him exactly the right amount of time for him to get over his feelings for her. And I'll leave it to the imagination of the reader to think about how long it was before he and Fanny kind of moved towards marriage and before he reciprocated her affections. So she just does not give any details and says, I'll leave it to you to think about how long this actually took and how long it is reasonable to have your heart broken and then to form a new attachment. We don't get to see that happen.
Right. Well, and it makes me wonder if that's part of why the book isn't quite as popular as the others, because despite the fact that we don't talk about poetic justice as poetic justice much, the irony is, I think most of us all want to see it. Even if we don't know what to call it, we want justice at the end. We want our heroes and heroines to get their happy ending. Even if it's cool to make fun of the happily ever after, I think we all still want it.
We still do want it. I think, that's why so many, I don't know, big budget Hollywood films still abide by that formula. It's because it's kind of what sells, and it's what people, even if you're exactly right, they don't want to fully admit it. That's
right.
There is that deep hunger, I think,
I think
to see
so.
people get what they deserve.
Well, and it leads to my next question: is happily ever after just this vapid, patriarchal, Hollywood cliche for profit? Is that all it is?
Yes, there are some people who argue that. So this is a big kind of strand, if you want to call it that, in Austen criticism. So there are a lot of people, scholars and non-scholars, who are kind of disturbed by the consistency with which Austen marries off her heroines, usually to wealthy, landed, and by landed I mean they have a really nice estate in England. Not all of them are like that, but the most famous ones, Mr. Darcy and his 10,000 a year and his beautiful estate of Pemberley. This is something that, some readers find disturbing. Does Austen kind of think that her heroines can only be happy if they marry wealthy men who can kind of take care of them? Is this really what happiness is? Is just having a large income and a wealthy husband? And so some readers think that, well, there are two camps of readers, I would say, who are kind of disturbed by the endings. There are those who want to kind of rescue Austen from herself and say, yes, she does end the novels in this way. And you never get, a novel where it doesn't end in marriage for the heroine. It's how they all end. And so one response is, okay, yes, Austen kind of gives into the convention of the happy ending, but if you read it really carefully, she's actually kind of secretly undermining the whole thing with irony, right? So when she says that, the hero and the heroine find perfect happiness, she doesn't really mean that. It might mean something else.
Right.
So that's one camp of readers. Then the other camp, it's a little bit more straightforward. It's like, yes, Austen just has this kind of, she's a product of her time.
Yeah.
She marries off the heroines. This is what it is. And this is a concession to, the kind of patriarchal society of early Regency England, where the best a woman could expect and hope for was to get married.
Right. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but my question was intentionally leading in that all these readings seem to very much miss the punchline. And for as much as Jane Austen's work may be dismissed as feminine and too happy and whatever else, there's a remarkable level of intelligence throughout her novels and a remarkable amount of respect in the relationships and the good relationships between men and women. And in your recent lecture, you also had this line, which I think really helped summarize things, where you're talking about the ending of Pride and Prejudice, and I think of Persuasion too. And you talk about these happy endings reflecting the reality and wisdom of divine providence.
Yes. Yeah, so here is where I think we have missed something as readers, and where we might be inclined to misread Austen if we strip away the kind of Christian context that would have been pretty kind of taken for granted, I think, among Austen's own readers. So the idea of poetic justice, just to go back to that earlier concept, we might wonder why, again, it sounds kind of naive. Why should the wicked be punished and the virtuous rewarded? Why was this such a serious issue? Why did all of the most intelligent readers and writers and critics of this period care about this issue so much?
Right.
And the answer to that is because these writers believed that what was at stake was really kind of the fundamental nature of reality. So, drawing on Aristotle, pretty much everyone in the 18th century agreed that poetry or literature, fiction, should be an imitation of reality. It should hold up a mirror to the world and show things as they really are. So that was one fundamental assumption. The question we might ask is, well, what did they believe the reality of the world was? Yeah. And for them, for almost all of these writers, they believed that the world was governed and ordered by divine providence, that the nature of reality was discernible through reason and through Christian revelation, and that a benevolent God had ordered the world intelligibly for us to understand, and that there was a kind of rational, intelligible, moral order as well. So John Dennis, he's not very well known anymore, but he was one of the major critics of the early 18th century. And he said that the reason why the end of, and in his case, he's talking mostly about plays and about dramatic performance. But he said that plays should end with virtue rewarded and vice punished, because this is an imitation of the divine dispensation, right? So if we believe, or if these writers believed, that there is a good God that governs the world, and that after we die, we're going to be judged according to our actions, then a play should reflect that reality, or a work of literature, a novel, a poem. And so this is why it's such a big deal. If you think that in reality, your virtuous actions, even if you're suffering immensely throughout your life, will ultimately be rewarded with happiness in heaven, a story should reflect that somehow.
Which makes sense to me. And ultimately, it comes down to metaphysics and how we engage with reality. And something you drew upon in your lecture was not just Austen's real expertise when it comes to realism, but also her symbolism too. You talk about like storms and imagery that she uses while writing something that is still very, very real. Yeah, exactly. So she is certainly a kind of social realist. And that is how she is frequently, and I think very justly read. But what we tend to overlook, I think, is the way that she's also a moral realist, and a Christian moral realist. And so there are these really interesting ways that are so easy to overlook, where like the natural landscape will reflect some psychological or emotional or moral reality about the character. Right. And so it's like symbolism light. She's not hitting you over the head with it. Austen is a very subtle writer. And I also mentioned Virginia Woolf's statement on this in the lecture. She said that Austen is the hardest author to catch in the act of greatness. And I think that's just true of her art in general. She's kind of subtle, and the craft with which she structures everything is easily overlooked. Which is sort of the greatness in itself, that it disappears as you're just engaged in the story. Yeah. And I mean, and you drew my attention to things I'd never thought about in Austen. I mean, even the idea that some of the phrasing is alluding to prayer, that there are times when the main characters, you interpret them as praying, and rereading those passages, then I was like, oh, I see it, but I never saw that before. Yeah, exactly. And so this is, just for listeners who are curious about this, the passage I was looking at in particular, or at least the language Austen uses, is the word serious. Anytime you see that word serious in Jane Austen, this for her and her early readers would have meant kind of religious seriousness. Yeah. So... when Emma, after Mr. Knightley proposes and all of the kind of tangles of the plot have been unknotted, Emma is so overjoyed that she has to kind of
quiet herself and step aside and kind of gives herself up to grateful and serious meditation and reflection, which I think, and this is not my insight, other scholars have pointed this out, but this for Austen would, and to her readers, would clearly have signaled like she is in prayer right now.
And there's a certain humility or a sense of gratitude to all this, too, that the heroines acknowledge, it seems, that they acknowledge how extraordinary their circumstances are, that ideally they don't take it for granted that they have happy endings. Even though we as readers approach the novels now expecting happy endings from Austen, the characters ideally don't take that ending for granted.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that's a really good point. None of the characters really expect things to work out in the way that they do. Really strikingly, I think, is the end of Persuasion. So we tend to think about this all from the heroine's point of view because the narratives is kind of focalized through their perspective. But often the heroes, the kind of main love interest, the future husbands of the heroines, go through these similar kind of moral character arcs that are a little bit more off the page or in the background. And the best example of this is Captain Wentworth at the end of Persuasion. Captain Wentworth has been, so the backstory is that Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth, we're told at the beginning of the novel, had fallen in love when they were both quite young, and the family disapproved of the match. He was kind of an ambitious young sailor in the Navy and wanted to make his fortune. They broke off the engagement, and he went off to fight in the Napoleonic Wars. He comes back. This is when the novel begins, and he has this grudge against Anne for breaking off the engagement and breaking his heart. But he is too prideful to admit that Anne may have made the right choice, that, maybe they weren't ready to get married and she was right to follow the advice of her family. So anyway, at the end of the novel, he tells Anne after they come to an understanding and they get engaged, and he says, essentially, I don't deserve to be as happy as I am. I don't deserve a second chance because I was so prideful and I would not see that you were at all just in your decision to act. And if I'm happy now, it's not through my own merit. I didn't deserve it. So he does kind of have this moral arc, this moment of self-knowledge where he realizes how wrong he's been acting. But yeah, he certainly doesn't take it for granted.
Can happy endings exist after the death of God? If we exist in a completely secular world that doesn't acknowledge moral truths, can we still have happy endings?
Yeah. Can we still have happy endings?
Or can we have ones that land, that are believable? I mean, sure, we can have kind of surface level happiness, but can we really, really appreciate happy endings in their full, like, as they ought to be, if we're viewing everything through an entirely secular and even materialist lens?
Yeah. So if our kind of fundamental assumption is the death of God, there is no moral truth. I think you're right. I think this is why happy endings, when they appear in something like a Hallmark movie, seem so cheap, because they're not rooted in any deeper metaphysical reality. They're kind of unearned. They don't. It comes across more as wishful thinking rather than an earnest effort to tell the truth about the reality of the world. At least I think that's how it most often plays. And I'm trying to think of if there are any movies that take seriously, that are a kind of throwback to an older metaphysical reality that someone like Jane Austen would have recognized. That the purpose of the story is to reflect, the workings of Providence, where the happy ending does feel earned. Nothing is coming to mind. I don't know if you can think of anything, but
no, I'm finding that more and more of my favorite stories and even movies are from the past these days. It's hard to find much
Yeah.
that's current that really resonates, I think, for the reasons you've articulated.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just such a common feeling to kind of come out of a movie feeling totally demoralized and cynical.
Yeah. Yeah, either because the
Yeah.
ending was sad and awful or because it was happy, but it just fell flat. It just doesn't resonate anymore.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So on that note, to end on a slightly happier note, I would love a book recommendation. If listeners have never read Jane Austen, which of her novels should they start with?
Such a great question. I think the best starting place is you already know the answer. It's Pride and Prejudice, her most famous, her lightest, brightest, sparkling novel, I think is how she described it. It's Austen at her best. Well, maybe not. Emma might be her most mature novel, but it has kind of, it shows Austen at her brightest and her wittiest. She's an extremely funny writer, and it's just a delightful read. So I would start with Pride and Prejudice, and then save Mansfield Park until the end when you're already bought in and willing to do the harder work to get through that novel.
And should they ideally read the book before watching one of the movies? Do you have strong feelings on that?
I think so. There's nothing wrong actually with seeing the movies first. My first introduction to Jane Austen was when I was in middle school, and my best friend wanted to watch Sense and Sensibility, and I had never heard of Jane Austen before. I'd never heard of this movie, and I absolutely loved it. That was the beginning of the end. And so I think at best what purpose the movies can serve is to give you the hunger to go search out the books for yourself.
Totally. I love it all. I love Austen.
Yes.
So.
And side note, if you're going to watch A Pride and Prejudice, if you've already seen the Keira Knightley version, I'm sorry it's too late. But if you haven't, don't start with that one. Start with the 1995 BBC Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth and Jennifer Ely. It's by far the best adaptation.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Audrey.